Hello and welcome to Viewpoint on Ukraine today. We're joined by Ukraine's new representative to the United Nations, Volodymyr Yelchenko. The newly appointed diplomat is no stranger to politics. He held the same position between 1997 and 2000, prior to becoming Ukraine's ambassador to Russia. Welcome to Viewpoint.
Good morning.
So what will be some of the main tasks that you'll be faced with at the UN?
Well, basically, I think that the priority task for our delegation in the UN will be definitely the situation in and around Ukraine, the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, the situation in Crimea, annexation of Crimea. This is basically the set of issues which are of greatest concern for our country. This is about sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, and obviously the UN is the best place to defend these kind of issues.
Mm-hmm. Do you plan to continue to pursue Ukraine's aim to strip Russia of its veto power at the UN Security Council?
Well, you know, it's a kind of mistake when people think that that the Security Council can reform itself. It's up to the General Assembly, to the Special Conference. The changes to the UN Charter will be needed. And obviously, the permanent members of the UN Security Council will never give up their veto rights. There are different ways to do something like that. For example, so-called collective veto, when the decision is blocked by more than one country. But I think this is far away from being implemented.
But do you believe that there should be new members reassigned to the Security Council?
Yes. This is the easiest thing out of all issues of the Security Council reform. The majority of countries believe that 15 members is not enough. Both categories, permanent and non-permanent members, should be expanded. We are talking about like, 21, 23, 24 countries. But again, each region which is represented in the Security Council has its own quota. So, for example, Africans believe that they need to be represented by at least one permanent member. Same with Latin America, Asia. Probably Europe is not the case because there are already 2 or 3 permanent members from European continent. So there's a long road. I think that this work should continue. Obviously, we will raise those issues, but as I said, this is not up to the membership of the Security Council. This is a more general task, and we will do it as delegation of Ukraine to the United Nations, in the General Assembly, in the appropriate working group on the reform, and in other places.
Will you try to bring Russia back to the negotiating table regarding Crimea?
Well, obviously, UN is an excellent place for any kind of negotiations. But as we know, there is a so-called Minsk group. There is a Normandy format. In these formats, we talk with Russia. I would not be against at all to talk to Russia in the United Nations framework, but we will see. Up to now, unfortunately, if I'm not mistaken, there were up to 30 meetings of the Security Council on the Ukrainian issue, and unfortunately, Russia successfully blocked at least 2 times the decisions where we were trying to at least signal the issue of Crimea, or, for example, the issue of the shooting down of Malaysian Airlines. In July last year, when Russia blocked the decision on the creation of the International Tribunal. So up to now, we were not successful, say, to talk Russia in.
Will you try to kind of change the different, like a different policy, perhaps, to change the situation?
Well, the only policy is to continue negotiations. We need to convince Russia that this situation can be resolved. But up to now, there is a willing on the side of Ukraine, but unfortunately, we don't see such kind of position on the side of Russia.
I see. As Ukraine's newly representative at the UN, I'd like to talk about a recent UN report issued in December, which states that a limitation of freedom of movement of people at checkpoints in Ukraine, and the UN have called for the attention that they're very poor sanitation there and so on, and conditions are very poor, and there's traffic, and people can't get in and can't get out, and it increases a sense of isolation for the people living in the occupied territories. Now, what kind of position will you try to stand there at the UN when these kinds of points will be brought to your attention?
Well, the issue does exist. I admit it. I think that the best solution would be the return of control of Ukraine over the line of the Ukrainian-Russian border. But it will be possible only after Russia will withdraw its troops and permits at least the OSCE monitors or probably UN monitors in the future to be there to control the movement. In this case, all those problems which you mentioned will be easier to solve. On the other hand, I think that that is exactly where UN can play a better role, because UN has its presence on the ground. I recently met the UN representative in Ukraine, and he told me that they were successful in solving at least small technical issues, for example, taking people by special buses, like pensioners, old people, which are under UN control. So they are working along the line, and
so they help pensioners move across
without waiting in big lines. Or for example, they also deliver a lot of humanitarian aid. So UN is there, UN is active, and I think that we can do much more, taking decisions in New York, which will permit UN be even more active in the east of Ukraine, and of course in Crimea too.
So along the line of contact, perhaps more aid, is that what you want to see?
More aid, more UN presence, at least in the sense of humanitarian assistance and helping people. We're not talking yet about the UN military presence or some kind of peacekeeping operation, because it's difficult to achieve. Russia is against, and frankly speaking, not even all other members of the Security Council are very happy with this kind of idea. But in our opinion, obviously the UN peacekeeping presence would be the best solution.
I see. Let's move on to your previous experience. You worked as Ukraine's ambassador to Russia. You were there for several years. How do you think experience working in Moscow alongside Kremlin officials, how do you think that will influence your work now at the UN?
Well, I think this experience will definitely help me. Well, first of all, I know well the style and the forms of Russian diplomacy. By the way, they're very tough diplomats. In our case, this is very unfortunate for us, but this is something which any country would agree.
Sorry, when you say tough diplomats, do you mean it's hard to find a compromise?
Yes, it's very hard to find a compromise. It's even harder when you talk in the UN, because you need to talk not only to Russia, but to others to convince them in your own position. On the other hand, I have a lot of I wouldn't call it friends, of course, now, but people with whom I had long relations, both during my term in Moscow and also before that in the United Nations, for example. So I know many people, dozens, if not hundreds, and not only from Russia, diplomats first of all. I think it will be easier, because in diplomacy, the most important thing is to establish personal relationship. When you have a relationship, you can even be a colleague, but of course, when it comes to the issue of national interest, you cannot just, sell issues. But still, it helps. It helps when you know personally your counterparts.
Well, I'm sure your vast experience working in Russia will help you at the UN, and we wish you all the best of luck.
Thank you very much.
This has been Mr. Volodymyr Yelchenko. He is Ukraine's new representative to the United Nations. You've been watching Viewpoint on Ukraine Today.